For it is thought to be most intimately connected with our human nature, which is the reason why in educating the young, we steer them by the rudders of pleasure and pain. It is thought, too, that to enjoy the things we ought and to hate the things we ought has the greatest bearing on virtue of character. There's much to discuss in this first chapter of Book 10. I'll start with the phrase that shows up here in the first sentence, our human nature. Let's observe first that when we talk about human nature, we're back at our old friend, philosophical anthropology. As we've seen, philosophers, and non-philosophers for that matter, have not only been arguing about what constitutes human nature, but also whether there is such a thing. Here we see that Aristotle assumes there is such a thing. We can't be too quick to assume he means by that the same thing others mean when they too claim there is a human nature. We saw just in the previous book that he can question the full humanity of slaves. Whenever we talk about human nature, we have to ask the question, just who counts as human, as entities who share in this common nature? What follows, Aristotle will identify certain practices and patterns as common to human nature. Even if we go along with him in using the language of human nature, we'll still need to ask whether what he attributes to human nature should in fact be attributed to humans qua humans and not to ancient Greeks or other cultural groups of his era. Besides assuming there is a common human nature, Aristotle's claim involved other assumptions. The next assumption is that there is a common human practice of educating the young. It might seem that this is too obvious to mention. Thinking a thing too obvious is usually a mistake for a philosopher. Of course, that's one of the things that can get us into trouble. Things that are obvious to ordinary people, that is, to non-philosophers, aren't so obvious to us. When we question either the position or the commonly accepted epistemic status of the position, non-philosophers can get seriously annoyed with us. The most common epistemic status that philosophers question is that of certainty. Philosophers have a habit of not being certain of things that ordinary people assume are in fact certain. Let's skip that research. Since this isn't a class in educational history, we've noted that there's a question, and that's good enough for our purposes. So here we are with a common human practice of educating the young. We educate them by steering them by the rudders of pleasure and pain. Using this metaphor, children are like ships. They could just run wild under the influence of water currents or the wind. But we don't want that. We want to steer them. We want them to go someplace, or at least to avoid going other places. The place we want them to go is the life of virtue. The place we want them to avoid is the life of vice. Both are places they could go. Should we stop a moment and question my use of place? I choose the word because it fits well with Aristotle's metaphor. Ships, insofar as they are functioning as ships, are going someplace. They are in motion. Children are in motion. They are going someplace. The place they go could be a life of virtue, could be a life of vice. Place can be deceptive in this context, however, if we take his metaphor too literally. We'd like to think we're steering the young to a life of virtue. But is such a life, such a place possible in a pure sense? That is a life that is wholly virtuous, entirely lacking in vice. Put another way, by using the language of place, do we overemphasize the destination at the cost of the journey which remains ongoing? Let's remember another word from our earlier reading, telos. As those who steer the young, we aim to impart a telos, the telos of a virtuous life. Or perhaps we should say a life of increasing virtue and decreasing vice. We're obviously taking a long time to get to Aristotle's main point. The main topic of this book 10 is pleasure. We steer the young toward the proper telos by means of the rudders of pleasure and pain. We want pleasure to accompany the actions that lead to virtue. pain to accompany the actions that lead to vice. We can also bring in the language of consequences. We want to set up educational experiences so that actions that take people in the direction of virtue have the consequence of pleasure for the one performing the action, and the consequences of pain for those performing actions that lead to vice. I perceive the need for a slight detour here. What is the relationship between pleasure and pain? Are they opposites? If they are opposites, how opposed are they? Is it the case that any action or experience that results in pleasure only results in pleasure? And likewise, every action or experience that results in pain only results in pain? Is it ever possible that an action or experience could result in a mix of pleasure and pain? Let's ask the epistemological question here also. How do we tell the difference between pleasure and pain? Do the raw feels, the sensory data that come to us, announce themselves as pleasure or pain? Or do they require interpretation? Do we have to learn to interpret the raw feel as pleasure or as pain? Are there any raw feels that are neither pleasure nor pain? Are there any that are or appear to be a mixture of the two? When we say, whether to ourselves or to others, and speak without prevarication, irony, or sarcasm, that we are feeling pleasure or pain, under what conditions, if any, are we justified in identifying those feelings with certainty? Can I be mistaken when I identify something as pleasure or pain? Can it ever be the case that at one point, perhaps immediately, I say of an experience, I am experiencing pleasure, but later say, I was wrong to think that experience was pleasure. I see now that it was in fact pain? Or adding even more complexity, is it ever possible to take pleasure in experiencing pain or to be pained in experiencing pleasure? Let's let that rabbit run on for a bit. If you want to chase him, go ahead. In the meantime, let's return to Aristotle and ask a question more directly implied by the text. Have you ever experienced yourself being steered by either pleasure, something you liked or sought out, or by pain, something you disliked and sought to avoid? What are some examples of learning experiences that were either designed for you or that you experienced that successfully motivated you by using one or both of these rudders? One final observation before we continue. What do you make of Aristotle's assumption that there are some things we ought to enjoy and others we ought to hate? What are some of the things that would have to be the case if there were indeed things that ought to be enjoyed and things that ought to be hated? If there are such things, and I think there are, my guess is that as those who are in a position to do the steering, we begin by imposing this on those we are steering. Over time, ideally, we impose less and less as those who we are steering come to see for themselves that some things are to be enjoyed, some to be hated. And why? Through our steering, we are aiming them not only toward the telos of the virtuous life, but toward an understanding of the virtuous life and what it is that makes such a life desirable. The telos of our educational effort, then, will not just be that they are on a course toward living a virtuous life, but also that the desire for such a life, as well as a vision regarding how to achieve it, has been internalized. Some say pleasure is the good, while others, on the contrary, say it is thoroughly bad. Some, no doubt, being persuaded that the facts are so, and others thinking it has a better effect in our life to exhibit pleasure as a bad thing, even if it is not. For most people, they think, incline toward it and are slaves of their pleasures, for which reason they ought to lead them in the opposite direction, since thus they will reach the middle state. That's Aristotle, by the way. We assume, okay, maybe that's an unfair assumption. Many assume that pleasure is good and pain is bad. What could be wrong with pleasure? Isn't it something everyone wants and seeks? Well, yes, but that's the problem. If we assume that pleasure is good, must we also assume that pleasure is a reliable indicator of the good? Is it ever possible that pleasure or the pursuit of pleasure could lead us astray? Consider Armin Meiwes. He put out an advertisement once for someone to be slaughtered and consumed. Someone took him up on the offer. He came to Meiwes and agreed for Meiwes to kill him and eat him. Sounds nasty to me. Apparently, it didn't sound nasty to Meiwes. If Meiwes found pleasure in killing and eating this fellow, could I get away with saying that at least in this case, pleasure was not an accurate indicator of the good? Of course, that's an extreme case. Very few people do anything like what Meiwes did. But what about other things people find pleasurable? Are all these things that are found pleasurable things that lead us toward the life of virtue? The fear is that the power of pleasure is such that it enslaves us. As we see here, Aristotle thinks that protest against pleasure is incorrect. He'll be making this case in the book through his analysis of pleasure and how it works. As you might suppose from reading this far in his work, you'll see that his understanding of pleasure doesn't match up exactly with the way we, or ordinary people, understand pleasure. In chapter 5, at 1175a, line 29, Aristotle says, each of the pleasures is bound up with the activity it completes, for an activity is intensified by its proper pleasure. Since each class of things is better judged of and brought to precision by those who engage in the activity with pleasure, for example, it is those who enjoy geometrical thinking that become geometers and grasp the various propositions better. And similarly, those who are fond of music or of building and so on make progress in their proper function by enjoying it. So the pleasures intensify the activities. And what intensifies a thing is proper to it. But things different in kind have different properties, have properties different in kind. Reading this, we see that there is not just pleasure in the singular, but pleasures in the plural. These pleasures we see differ from each other and are matched to the particular activities that accompany or produce them. There are pleasures associated with geometry. Can you believe such a thing? I did my course in geometry over 40 years ago, so I have few memories of the course and none of the pleasures I could have experienced therein. I do remember, however, helping my kids with math homework in more recent times. I clearly remember the pleasure associated with solving an equation. Have any of you had a comparable experience? Perhaps it was the pleasure that came with getting a chemistry formula to balance, or performing a piece of music that you'd spent hours and hours practicing. When I read a pleasure in this context, I think of a different word that might get more the sense of what Aristotle means by pleasure: satisfaction. The practices in which we engage, whether they be mathematical, scientific, musical, or athletic, among others, each has a telos. When we achieve that telos, we feel a sense of satisfaction, a sense that we have reached the telos internal to that practice. Sometimes the best word for our assessment of our state at that point is pleasure. Other times it might be a sense of satisfaction. In the next paragraph, Aristotle says, this will be even more apparent from the fact that activities are hindered by pleasure arising from other sources. Remember a moment ago some of the pleasures that may be experienced with some educational or academic practices. It's possible that some of you have engaged in these practices, but have not experienced the pleasure tied to that activity. It might even be that you have found yourself distracted by the pleasures associated with other activities. Some of these other activities could be worthless. Some could simply be worth less. Some could be completely good in themselves, yet still function as distractions from our pursuit of other goods. At 1175b, line 15, we see Aristotle referring to proper and alien pleasures. Given our discussion, can you see what he means by these terms? Let's now turn to what Aristotle has to say at the transition from 1175b to 1176a. As activities are different, then, so are the corresponding pleasures. Now, sight is superior to touch and purity, and hearing and smell to taste. The pleasures, therefore, are similarly superior. and those of thought superior to these. And within each of the two kinds, some are superior to others. The first sentence reiterates the claim we've already been considering. Not every activity has the same pleasure associated with it. Pleasures differ according to the activity. I get that. But what about the next two claims? First, there's the claim that some senses are superior in purity to others. How do we know this? If we do know it, why would we think purity matters in this case? I remember seeing ads for some soap brand that claims the soap is something like 99.96% pure. Pure what? Soap? Soap substance? I guess that's good. But what's the rest of it made out of? Is it something harmless? If it's harmless, that's great. What if it's plutonium? Plutonium, if inhaled, is very deadly. Why would I want my pleasure to be pure? Second, there's the claim that pleasures of thought are superior to other pleasures. Again, why does he make this claim? What reasons can you see in your reading that might form a basis for this claim? Are you convinced? At 1176b, line 23, Aristotle says, it is to be expected then that as different things seem valuable to boys and to men, or to children and adults, so they should seem to bad people and to good. Notice how this connects to character. The character of a person at least partly determines what seems good or valuable to that person. The character of a child is different from the character of an adult, if in no other way than maturity. Likewise, the character of a good person is different from the character of a bad person. It's the character we point to when we identify a person as good or bad. Have you noticed this in your own life or in the lives of the people around you? That as your character changes, what you value changes. There's a causal relationship between character and our acts of valuing. Aristotle is here pointing at the causal flow running from character to valuation. I'd suggest it goes the other way also. What we value also has a causal influence on our character. As we practice valuing good things, our character can change. What do you think? Do you think the causal relation can work both directions? We can also step back a moment. Do we believe with Aristotle that there is such a thing as a good character and a bad character? If we believe this, what kind of person would value being or becoming a person of good character, or being or becoming a person of bad character? Socrates would likely have argued that no one would say she wanted to become a person of bad character. Now, it might be, according to Socrates, that a person truly did aim to be a person of bad character, but such a person would do so believing that those character qualities were actually good. Let's say that you value becoming a person of good character, or if you already reckon yourself to be a person of good character, you value becoming a person of better character. What are some of the practices you would take up to become such a person? How do we discover what practices are conducive to becoming a person of good character? When there are disputes about what constitutes a good character, how do we adjudicate between them? A bit farther on in the last lines of 1176b and going into 1177a, Aristotle talks about amusement. Amusement is not the same thing as happiness. The word translated amusement has the sense of childish play. We might even broaden it a bit and translate it as fun. Happiness, eudaimonia for Aristotle, and for later philosophers too, is a broader and larger concept than fun or amusement. We see this when in the first line of 1177a, he says the happy life is thought to be virtuous. Now, a virtuous life requires exertion and does not consist in amusement. When I look around, I see many contexts in which amusement is more popular than exertion. Living a virtuous life, a life of excellence, a life in which we achieve our telos, requires work and focus. What do you think? Do you have experience that leads you to believe this claim of Aristotle's? He starts chapter 7 saying, if happiness is activity in accordance with virtue, it is reasonable that it should be in accordance with the highest virtue, and this will be that of the best thing in us. Now, this would seem to be in agreement both with what we said before and with the truth. For firstly, this activity is the best, since not only is reason the best thing in us, but the objects of reason are the best of knowable objects. And secondly, it is the most continuous, since we can contemplate truth more continuously than we can do anything. I bet some of you are saying, look there, we're back at philosophical anthropology, building what we say on claims about the nature of what it means to be human. That is true. Aristotle wrote early on in the Nicomachean Ethics that the primary thing that distinguished us from other things was our reason. Reason is the highest part of the human. Using our reason, then, that is, engaging in rational activity, is the best and most fully human thing we can do. The more time we do that, which is most fully human, the more aligned we will be with our telos and therefore more likely to find happiness. If this claim about reason is true, it seems plain that many people do not believe it. At least from what I see in the world, many people do not put a high value on reason and on reasoning well. What have you seen in your experiences of the world? Do you see most people putting a high value on reasoning and reasoning well? What features of our current society most help people put a value on reasoning? What features detract from valuing reasoning? Personally, I value reasoning and reasoning well. My anthropology differs from Aristotle's, however, so I don't put reasoning or contemplation, a form of reasoning, as the highest activity, the activity most conducive to happiness. I'm going to close out my observations on this book of the Nicomachean Ethics with some of Aristotle's theology in chapter 8. We see here, beginning at 1178b, line 9, that if we're looking for the highest example of happiness, we should look no further than the gods. We see in this section that his idea of the gods differs almost entirely from the stories we read in Greek mythology. Those stories have the gods constantly engaging in various activities. Not only are the gods always busy, but if we were to judge them by the actions they performed, we'd have to say they were not a very high character. But Aristotle's not willing to say that. His idea of the gods is that they are truly high, beyond all activity that would mire them in the world of human action and frailty. The gods don't run around doing human-like activities as the myths depict them doing. What activities do they do? Aristotle is plain. They contemplate. They think. Given this assumption about the gods, Aristotle's argument makes sense. Consider these steps. Number 1, the gods are supremely happy. 2, we want to be supremely happy. 3, because we want to be supremely happy, we should aim to be like the gods. 4, the gods are happy because of their virtuous activity. 5, their virtuous activity is contemplation. And 6, when we engage in contemplation, as the gods do, we are more likely to achieve happiness. So here we are at the end. If you're like me, you didn't agree with everything you've read in Aristotle. You probably not agreed with all my comments on Aristotle. The point of philosophy is not finding books or teachers we agree with and sticking to them. The point is to find books and articles and people that provoke us and make us think.